Hello, everyone. So good to be here with you today. Um, and yeah, I'm a professor in the psychology department here at UC Berkeley. And I'm going to be telling you today about some of the work that we've been doing in India on how children conceptualize rules that come from their religion. Okay, and hopefully there'll be a little bit of time at the very end for questions if anybody is interested. So religions vary in what practices they deem right and wrong, right? So religions introduced various rules for things like eating or dressing and so on. So for example, in Hinduism, as it's practiced in Gujarat, where we do our research in India, eating beef is prohibited and dead bodies must be cremated. On the other hand, there also are members of another religious community who living side by side Hindus, so Muslim people in Gujarat, and they have their own norms, right? So some Muslim norms include not depicting Allah or Muhammad, no daytime eating during the month of Ramadan. So importantly, these religious norms they offer sort of a framework for which one can live their life, right? So they offer a sense of purpose for children growing up in these regions, and they offer a sense. Yeah, no problem, no problem. And they also sort of importantly are leading children to view some kinds of actions as right and wrong. And importantly, because children and adults in these communities are living side by side, they are sort of forced to take a stance on how broadly they should apply these norms, right? So a Hindu child is growing up in India has to sort of decide. They might witness their neighbors eating beef. They might witness their neighbors burying dead bodies, right? They need to make a decision as to sort of whether that's okay or not okay. And what I'll be arguing today is that peaceful coexistence, especially in pluralistic communities, is going to depend in part on being able to successfully restrict the scope of one's own norms as applying to only members of your own religious group and not to members of another religious group. So in fact, we've seen lots of tragic examples in India as well as in other societies where individuals from one community actually appear to over-apply their norms when evaluating the actions of people from another community. So for example, in India, between 2016 and 2019, over 40 people were killed, many people injured, under suspicion for being involved in the cattle trade. And most of these people were Muslims. And one of these Hindu cow protectors, these vigilantes who committed this violence, says that in our beliefs, it says that the cow is the mother of the whole world. Every country and every state should believe in it, right? So this is really an example of really believing that the norms from one's own religion have a broad scope and apply to everybody. So today, what I'm going to be telling you about is some research that my colleagues and I have been doing, over the past 5 to 10 years, where we're trying to understand how children are introduced to religious norms and how they come to reason about them. In particular, we think that children's developing ability and concepts of religious norms and their ability to restrict them to apply only to one group could actually play an important role in whether communal conflicts are prolonged over time or whether they're in fact reduced over time. So what are really the conditions that lead a society toward more conflict or toward more tolerance? That's really what we're interested in. So importantly, when children are first learning the religion and they're introduced to the religion, there's a number of problems that might lead them to sort of be confused as to the scope of the norms that they're introduced to, right? So for example, religious texts and authorities, they often are going to introduce not just these non-moral religious norms like don't eat beef, fast during Ramadan, but alongside those kinds of norms, they also are introducing moral norms. So things like you shouldn't harm someone else, you shouldn't steal from someone else, right? And these latter moral norms can be seen as having a broad scope, right? They apply universally to everybody because they sort of have intrinsic importance in how they affect victims, right? On the other hand, if you eat beef or if you don't fast during Ramadan, you're not actually affecting any victim, right? But it's possible that because these different kinds of norms are introduced alongside one another by authorities, religious authorities, children might believe that even the norms like not eating beef or fasting during Ramadan should have a broad scope and apply to everybody. Also, the scope of these norms is often not explicitly stated in religious texts or by authorities, so children sort of have to figure out for themselves how broadly they apply. And importantly, in a lot of the nations that we see today, there are emerging kind of trends where nations are sort of being conflated with religion, right? So we have associations between the state and religion, for example, in Sharia law cases, as well as in cases in India, where we've seen some states in India enact penalties for killing a cow, like a life sentence for killing a cow. So in these kinds of contexts, children are essentially seeing that at the national level, there's a law that is essentially sort of enforcing a religious rule, right? So the child might come to think that these religious rules really should be followed by everybody. So there's been some prior work on this topic in developmental psychology, but not really a whole lot of work. So some of the work here was done by Larry Nucci and Elliot Turiel here at Berkeley as well. They studied Amish children and Orthodox Jewish children living in the United States. And they presented them with various kinds of vignettes and sort of dilemmas and interviewed them about them. So for example, they asked the children to sort of consider for a moment that God had not said something one way or the other, for example, about whether one should not work on the Sabbath, right? And then they asked, would it be wrong to work on the Sabbath if God hadn't sort of weighed in one way or the other? And children from these communities essentially would say that God had the power to alter these norms, right? So if God had not weighed in on whether these were wrong, then they wouldn't in and of themselves actually be wrong. They also asked these children to think about hypothetical followers of other religions and whether they should also follow those norms. And in fact, what they found is that these children would indicate that it was okay for somebody who did not follow their religion to not follow these norms. So it's okay, for example, for a hypothetical other person who's not Jewish to work on the Sabbath. On the other hand, they made a sharp distinction between these religious rules and moral rules, like not harming someone, not stealing from someone. They said that for those rules, they really should be followed by everybody. Okay, so this is an important early evidence, right, that children are capable of restricting the scope of the norms from early in life, such that religious norms apply only to followers of that religion, whereas moral norms apply and generalize across everybody. Okay, so what we were interested in was how these kinds of findings might extend to a context like Gujarat in India, where there's been a lot more conflict between religious groups, right? So these Amish and Jewish children were studied largely in societies where they were largely homogeneous. They didn't have a lot of contact with members of other religions, and there wasn't a lot of religious conflict in their communities. So they might have been fairly permissive of these hypothetical transgressions of followers of another religion. But we were interested in whether the same thing would be true of Hindu children growing up alongside Muslim children in a region where they actually have had a fair amount of communal conflict. We also were interested in not just children's ideas about their own religion's norms and who they apply to, but also how they think about another group's norms, right? So how do Hindu children, for example, think about Muslim norms? Do they think that a Muslim child should follow Muslim norms? Or are they neutral about that? Or maybe they even think that it's wrong for a Muslim child to follow Muslim norms. So this was a question that was not really addressed in the Nucci and Turiel study that I mentioned before. Okay, so just to tell you a little bit more about the context of our research, this is taking place in Gujarat, which is a northwestern province in India. And Gujarat has been a center of Hindu-Muslim violence. So for example, in 2002, there was an incident where there was a train that was carrying Hindu religious pilgrims. It burst into flames. In the aftermath of that, Muslims were blamed for this and targeted, and there were riots that ensued, and as many as 2,000 people died, mostly Muslim people. And this actually ended up being a real focal point in the current ruling party's rise to power. So the Prime Minister of India at that time, Narendra Modi, was actually the Chief Minister of Gujarat at that time. And according to some, he did not do enough to sort of stop the violence, and he might have even sort of egged on the riots. So this is kind of an important context for studying this sort of communal conflict. We've also done a lot of prior research at this site where we've tried to quantify the intergroup bias that children who are growing up in these communities might develop. So we've used paradigms like the implicit association test. So for example, in this kind of test, you might see an image in the center, like a smiley face, and you have to press one key to indicate that on one side that it was, if it was a happy face, good, or if it was a frowny face, bad, you would use the other hand, right? And then at the same time, we would present them with the words Hindu and Muslim. And in some trials, Hindu sort of shared the positive association with the smiling face. And in other trials, it shared the negative association. So the idea is that if you have an implicit association that it associates Hindu with positive and Muslim with negative, then you'll be faster with one kind of response mapping than another. This is a kind of method that's been used quite a bit in psychology. And using this kind of method, we found, in fact, that Hindu children, the y-axis here is the sort of preference, the implicit preference for Hindus. Hindu children show a strong preference for Hindu kids by at least third grade. Muslim kids show the opposite, a strong preference for Muslims by the third grade. So we see already preference for their own group developing early in life here. We also have done other kinds of studies where we've tried to quantify the social networks in the schools that children are in. So this is a school that's about half Hindu and half Muslim. But what we find here is that, unsurprisingly, if you look at the green versus the red is male, so boys, and the red are girls. They're fairly segregated. So mostly the girls are nominating other girls as their friends, and the boys are nominating other boys. But you can also see that the sort of clustering of the circles versus triangles here, right? And basically the circles here are Hindu kids and the triangles are Muslim kids. So largely what we see is that the Hindu kids nominate other Hindu kids as their friends. The Muslim kids nominate other Muslims as their friends. So we see a lot of self-segregation in this school as well. Okay? So what we're really interested in here basically is that under these circumstances where we know that there's been a history of conflict in the region, we know that at this school, there's been a significant degree of intergroup bias and also segregation in friendship networks. Are children still capable of exhibiting religious tolerance under these kinds of circumstances? So here is the first study that we did here. So this was with 9 to 15-year-old Hindu and Muslim kids. We told them stories in which there was a protagonist in the story who violated a norm. And that norm across different stories might have been a Hindu norm, like not eating beef, a Muslim norm, like eating during daytime in Ramadan, or a moral norm, like not hitting somebody for no reason. So what we would do is that in the first story of each pair, the protagonist would violate a norm from their own religion. So this might be a Hindu child who, for example, goes to a restaurant and eats beef, okay? Next, we would have a next story in which a protagonist from the other religion violated the same norm. So a Muslim child who goes to a restaurant and eats beef, okay? And after that, we asked a series of questions. You see an example of the story here. We asked a question about the permissibility of that action. So in your opinion, is what Ganesh, who's the Hindu child, is what he did okay or not okay, and why? And we would also ask the same question about the Muslim child. We would also ask a question that was trying to get at the alterability of the permissibility of that action. So for example, we would ask, what if Ganesh's parents said it was okay to eat beef? Would it be okay then? And we would repeat this kind of question for other kinds of authorities. What if Ganesh's, what if all the Hindu priests and all the Hindus said it was okay to eat beef? Would it be okay then? And finally, what if all the Hindu gods said it was okay to eat beef? Would it be okay then? So importantly, we're repeating these questions not just for religious norms, but also for moral norms. So we might have a story like, Ganesh went up to another child and hit that child for no reason. We can ask whether that's okay or not okay. And we can also ask, what if the Hindu god said it was okay to hit someone for no reason? Would it be okay then? Okay, so we're trying to get a sense, do children make a distinction between religion and morality in this sense? Okay, so what I'm showing you here are the results of this first study. So I'm going to sort of walk you through the graphs here. So on the y-axis for each of these different graphs is the proportion of kids who said that the action was not okay, right? And you're going to see that in the solid line is the Hindu character, and then the dotted line is the Muslim character. And we have here the Hindu norms, here are the Muslim norms, and here's the moral norms. Okay. So what we see first is that children are more likely to say that it's not okay for a protagonist to violate their own religion's norms than to violate the norms of another religion. So you can see, for example, in the case of Hindu, the dark line, right, the solid line is the Hindu protagonist. It's more wrong, more not okay for them to violate a Hindu norm than for a Muslim protagonist to violate that norm. And you can see that the same judgments are given by Muslim children as well. So we have two different sort of age groups, younger age group and older age group. We see the reverse here for Muslim norms, right? So here it's more wrong for the Muslim protagonist to violate that norm than for the Hindu protagonist. And again, the pattern is similar across the two religious communities of the participants. And then finally, and importantly, we see that this is true regardless, right, of whether the child's religion matches that of the protagonist. So in other words, a Hindu child is saying here that it's wrong for a Muslim to violate Muslim norms, right? Although it's okay for a Muslim to eat beef, it's not okay for them to eat during daytime during Ramadan. So this, I think, shows kind of an interesting form of tolerance for another community. They're sort of endorsing the obligatory force of the norms of the other community rather than being neutral toward them. They think it's actually a good thing for the Muslim child to follow their respective norms. Finally, another thing that we can notice here is that we see an age difference, right? So in general, the younger children are more likely to say that the religious violations are not okay than the older children. So that's why you see the lines going down, with the one exception of the Muslim children when they're judging Muslim norms, right? So older Muslim children are just as often saying that it's wrong to eat during Ramadan as younger Muslim children. So we see a difference between the Hindu kids and Muslim kids in this respect. And I think that's interesting because Islam is a minority religion in this context. So it's possible that Muslims sort of see following their group's norms as sort of a way of preserving their identity and holding on to that. It's also possible that there are differences between the religions themselves. Maybe the Muslim norms are sort of seen as more obligatory and not a matter of personal choice to follow them. And then finally, we can see that the moral norm is virtually never seen as okay to violate by any group of kids. Okay, so regardless of religion, it's wrong to hit someone for no reason. Okay, so the next results focus on that alterability question. So this was the question that was asked: what if the person's parents said it was okay to eat beef? What if all the priests and all the Hindus said it was okay to eat beef? What if the Hindu god said it was okay to eat? And again, we have the four different quadrants here are the different participant groups. So younger Hindu kids, older Hindu kids, younger Muslim kids, and older Muslim kids. So I'm going to show you the results here. So the dark line, the solid line, is the moral norm, and then you see the Hindu and Muslim norms in the legend here. Okay. So the first thing that we can see is that as you sort of go up to higher levels of authority permission, so going from parents to priests and then to gods, generally the actions are seen as more okay, right? Generally they're seen as more okay. But importantly, we see this really interesting distinction between religious norms and moral norms here. So if we look just at the case of gods, you can see that if God gives permission to violate a norm, then it makes it okay to violate a Hindu or Muslim norm, but it doesn't make it nearly as okay to violate a moral norm, right? So you see the same kind of trend for each of the participant groups, except for the case of younger Muslim kids who seem to say that Allah can make it okay to hit someone for no reason. But we're not sure that this is necessarily replicable across every group. Okay? That's an interesting pattern. So this is interesting, right? Because what it's telling us, right, is that children are appreciating a transcendent morality beyond religion, right? So God can make it okay to violate religious rules like how you dress, how you eat, etc. But God can't make it okay to violate moral rules. And this actually, I think, goes against some other accounts and some popular accounts of religious people, as sort of in which morality is anything, all morality comes from religion. And that clearly isn't the case, at least for these kids here. So importantly, that school that we did this study in is about half Hindu and half Muslim. So it's possible that the sort of tolerant views that we saw for those kids sort of are a byproduct of having encountered children from another religious group in a regular day-to-day way. So we repeated the same kind of study, this time with Hindu children at a school that's almost exclusively Hindu. And we ended up finding very similar kinds of findings. So it's not required, at least, to have lots of degrees, a lot of sort of contact with people from another group to really appreciate that group doesn't need to follow your religious norms, right? We see the same kind of tolerance sort of emerging in another context as well that lacks that intergroup contact. Okay, so just to summarize thus far, what we're seeing is that even with a great degree of conflict in the region, as well as bias and segregation at the school at which children were studied, children can develop these sort of tolerant attitudes. So they're able to restrict their own religion's norms to apply only to members of their group. And not only that, they expect another group to follow their respective norms, right? So importantly, that developing tolerance doesn't require a lot of contact with members of another group, as I just reviewed. And again, children seem to appreciate an overarching morality. So they think that these religious norms are more alterable. So if God gives permission, it's okay to violate them. And they're also less generalizable. So they don't apply to members of other religious groups compared to moral norms. So moral norms are seen as applying to people of all groups, and God cannot make violating them okay. So that's sort of the takeaway so far. So one might sort of take from this that, in general, like, well, why does sort of conflict ever occur in pluralistic societies if we see sort of the seeds of tolerance already present in very young children? And to think about this, my collaborators and I thought, often religious conflicts occur because we are not simply expected to follow our own religious norms. In some contexts, we're expected to follow the norms of another group. In particular, when we enter into the spaces or contexts of another religious group, we're often subject to the norms of another religion. So you can see this, for example, in dress codes. So for example, if I go to the Vatican, I'm expected to dress a certain way, even though I'm not Christian, right? Same thing in a case like going to a mosque here. There are certain forms of dress that are appropriate and permitted within that context. And these kinds of norms apply to followers of that religion and non-followers of that religion alike. So similarly, right? And importantly, we see cases in history, including in recent history, where failures to sort of follow the norms of another group can be triggers of violence when you're in the context of that group. So in this case here, some of you might remember there was a Danish newspaper that published some cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad. There was also the French paper Charlie Hebdo that published a cartoon involving Muhammad, right? In both of these cases, these were deemed sort of offensive by the Muslim community, right? And they actually triggered violent sort of reactions, right? And a lot of violent conflicts coming from this, right? And so we can think that, even though in Islam, right, it's not allowed to depict a god or to depict the prophet, right? Hindus, for example, are allowed to depict gods, Christians are allowed to depict gods, and so on. But if you're sort of entering into the symbolic context of another group, in this case, by depicting the god or prophets of another group, then you're subject to that norm as well. So even though you're Hindu or you're Christian, or in this case, probably atheist, right? It's not appropriate to depict a god if you're depicting a Muslim god, right? And so that's what we really wanted to study in this next set of studies, was whether children consider both the individual's religion, but also the context, the religion of the context that individual is entering into. Okay? So this is really the key question: when, if ever, is a person subject or have to follow the norms of a religion that they do not actually believe in, right? And this is the idea that there are both individual and contextual determinants of religious norms. So we were interested in asking children and adults whether people should follow the norms of another religion when they're actually entering that other religion's context. And this is something that's going to occur very frequently in pluralistic societies where members of different religions are living side by side from one another, or follow people who don't even follow any religion. They're all living side by side, and the possibility of crossing religious boundaries becomes much more common, and there could be a risk of triggering conflict as a result. So imagine, for example, a case of a Hindu person eating during Ramadan, but they're in a Muslim home versus a Hindu home, right? Or a Hindu, right, drawing a picture of Ganesha, a Hindu god, versus drawing a picture of the Prophet Muhammad, right? So these could be evaluated in different ways based on the context. Similarly, a person might be expected to follow their own religion's norms, regardless of the context that they're actually in. So the norms of a person's own religion might follow them regardless of whatever context they enter into. So for example, a Muslim might be expected to eat during Ramadan, regardless of whether they're in the Muslim home or in a Hindu home. Or, sorry, they should be expected to fast during Ramadan during those, regardless of context, right? So that really was what we were interested in this next study. So I'm just showing the design of the study here. This time we were focusing on adolescents, so Hindu and Muslim 13 to 15-year-olds. And we also had a much larger sample of adult religious individuals from India. Most of them were Hindu, but we had a sizable proportion of Muslim participants as well. So we presented them with these kinds of norm violation stories. We asked them about 4 different norms. So 2 of them were Hindu norms, 2 of them were Muslim norms, and you can see the examples there. And importantly, what we did is we varied systematically the situation in which the norm was violated. Okay, so for example, on this side of the table here, we see whether the norm of the religion is matching the norm of the protagonist, the religion of the protagonist. So does the religion of the norm match the religion of the protagonist? So this would be a case, for example, where if it's a match, it might be a Muslim, for example, eating during Ramadan in a Muslim home, right? But a mismatch would be a case of a Hindu eating during Ramadan in a Muslim home, right? So in this case, the Hindu person does not match the religion of the norm, right? But you can see that we had a second dimension here, which was the norm of the context, the religion of the context. So those can either match or mismatch similarly, right? So a Muslim could eat during Ramadan in a Muslim home, or they could eat during Ramadan in a Hindu home. And in the latter case, that would be a mismatch because the Hindu home is not matching the religion of the actual norm. Okay, so we were interested basically in how children's judgments and adults' judgments would vary by these different kinds of contexts. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. Okay, so after presenting each of these stories, we then asked a series of different measures. So the first was whether the protagonist's action was okay or not okay, just as before. We also asked them to sort of rate how severe that violation was. And I'm not going to sort of present that today, but it's the same kind of pattern of judgments. And then finally, whether the protagonist should be punished for their action or not. And here we are really interested in whether violating these norms really is severe enough to get to the level of a conflict requiring punishment. Finally, because we had this large sample of adults, we were interested in individual level predictors of variation in these kinds of judgments. And we formed 2 different kinds of predictors. So the first predictor was what we call own group preference. So the degree to which the participant indicates they prefer members of their own religion compared to members of the other religion. We also asked them sort of how many friends they have of their own religion versus the other religion. So this was a measure of the degree to which they prefer members of their own group generally. And then finally, we also asked about religiosity. So we're interested in how religious the individuals self-identified as, right? How important is the religion to them, and how religious do they think that they are? Okay. Okay. So first, I'm going to show you the data from the judgment. So this was just the question of whether the action was okay or not okay. Okay, and I'm going to sort of walk you through this here. So we see here the 2 kinds of participants, and then we see here whether the religion of the protagonist matches the religion of the norm or not, right? And then we see on this part of the table, right, whether the religion of the context matches the religion of the norm or not. And then you can see that this is both the adolescent data as well as the adult data here. So first, I want to draw your attention to what I've highlighted in green here. So these are cases, right, where the norm religion does not match the protagonist religion or the context religion. So this would be a case, for example, of a Hindu person eating during daytime in Ramadan in their own home. You can see that those actions are virtually never deemed not okay, right? They're almost always thought of as being okay, right? But we can see that the situation changes quite a bit when we consider these other kinds of crossings of religious boundaries, right? So in the case where the norm religion matches the protagonist religion, but not the context religion, right? So this would be a case, for example, where a Muslim person eats during daytime in Ramadan, right? But they're doing that in a Hindu home, right? They're still saying that that's fairly bad, right? So what this tells us is that your religion, you're expected to follow your religion, even if you're in another context that does not sort of enforce that kind of norm, okay? And then finally, we see that they're most likely to say that it's not okay when the norm religion matches the context religion, and that's regardless of the characters, the protagonist religion. So for example, when you're in a Muslim home, right, and you eat during daytime in Ramadan, that's seen as not okay regardless of whether you're Hindu or Muslim. Okay, so context really plays an important role here. Okay, we see similar kinds of findings for the case of punishment, right? So in the case of punishment, we see that participants are rarely recommending punishment when there's no match, right? So when a Hindu person, for example, is eating during daytime in a Hindu home, very few people are saying that that should be punished. But the levels of recommended punishment are much higher for all of the other cases, right? So it seems as if, for example, when a Hindu person goes to a Muslim home and eats during Ramadan, people indicate that that is an action that's not okay and that it should be punished. Yeah. Okay, so finally, I want to show you these data here, right? Which are looking and visualizing at the sort of individual level predictors among adults, okay? So I'm showing you here 4 different quadrants, right? So this is whether the religion of the context matches the religion of the norm or not, so match versus mismatch, as well as whether the religion of the norm matches the protagonist's religion or not, match versus mismatch. And then you can see here the black line indicates, the solid line is indicative of the participant's religiosity. So if we go more toward the right on the axis, that indicates that these were participants who are more religious. They self-identified as being more religious. And then if we look at the dotted line, these are indicative of people who preferred their own group or had more friends of their own group compared to people who had less friends of their own group or prefer their own group less. Okay, so what can we make out of this? So first, if we focus our attention on these first 2 quadrants at the top here, just focusing on the case of religiosity, so that solid line, what we see is that individuals who identify as being more religious actually think that it's worse for a protagonist to break the protagonist's own religion's rules, right? So for example, a person who says that they're more religious thinks it's more wrong for a Muslim person to eat during Ramadan, during daytime in Ramadan, regardless of the context that they're actually in, whether it's matching context or not, right? This is regardless, interestingly, of whether the protagonist is following the participant's own religion. So I think that's quite interesting. What it's telling us is that, for example, a more religious Hindu person is saying that it's more wrong for a Muslim person to break the fast during Ramadan in daytime than a less religious Hindu person. So it might be somewhat surprising. You might think that a more religious person might be sort of more neutral or more negative toward the norms of another religion, but that's not what we see here. So what I think these findings tell us is that people who are more religious sort of see the intrinsic value in following religious norms. So even if you're in a context that does not sort of enforce that norm, so if you're a Muslim person in the Hindu home, you care about that norm because it comes from God. You care about your relationship to God. You think that that norm is important. And the more religious you are, the more likely you are to sort of take that kind of attitude. Okay? So finally, turning to these other 2 quadrants here, we see an interesting effect of own group preference. So that's the dotted line. Okay? And here what we see is that participants who prefer their own group more think it's more important for the protagonist to follow the rules of the context, regardless of whether it matches the protagonist's religion or not. So for example, it's important to not eat during daytime in Ramadan when you're in a Muslim home, regardless of whether the person is Hindu or Muslim. So that's sort of what we're seeing here. And again, this is true regardless of whether the context religion matches the participant's religion. So a Hindu person, again, with more in-group preference, own group preference, right, is saying that it's worse for somebody to violate a Muslim rule in a Muslim home. And so we think that this is also an interesting finding, is it's telling us that people who prefer their own group more, who spend more time with individuals of their own group, might have a general orientation toward promoting sort of homogeneity within different contexts. So in other words, when you're in a Muslim context, you follow their rules, but if you come to a Hindu context, you follow Hindu rules. It's kind of like a live and let live kind of mentality that we sort of see with the own group preference. Okay, so just to sort of discuss this a little bit more and synthesize this, what we generally see from the first study, right, is that generally children think that a person should follow the rules of their own religion and does not need to follow the rules of a religion that they don't adhere to, right? So it's okay for a Muslim person to eat beef, but they should sort of fast during Ramadan. But we see importantly that this can change dramatically when individuals cross religious boundaries. So when they cross religious boundaries, they're subject to the rules of the religion of that other context. So when a Hindu person enters into a Muslim context, they're subject to Muslim norms. Moreover, when they cross into another context, they are still subject to their own religion's rules. So a Hindu person in a Muslim context should nevertheless follow Hindu rules, right? And so we think that this is an important sort of predictor and explanation of why conflicts occur, both across religions as well as within religions, right? When across religions, a conflict can occur when you go to another group's context and violate their norms. But within a religion, conflict can occur as well if you think that a person from your religion should be adhering to those religious rules, even when they're in other contexts, right? Importantly, as I said, these kinds of religious crossings can even provoke calls for punishment. And in these pluralistic societies, and increasingly our modern societies are more and more pluralistic, individuals are often going to cross into other religious contexts, increasing those kinds of risks of conflict. Importantly, context itself is ambiguous and it's often disputed. So just taking the case of India itself here, here I'm showing you a picture of a place that was a mosque, Babri Masjid, but it was argued by some Hindus that it was built upon the site of Rama's birthplace, the Lord Rama's birthplace, a Hindu god's birthplace. And so there's been a lot of conflict about this particular site, right? And you can imagine it, what is the context of this? Is this a Hindu context? Is it a Muslim context? Whose rules should actually be followed in this particular case, right? And actually, this has been a highly politicized case where ultimately the Supreme Court in India ruled that it was in fact a Hindu site originally, and the mosque has been demolished and a new sort of Hindu temple has been built on its site. It's part of sort of the efforts of this Hindu nationalist government to sort of really promote Hinduism in India. Importantly, within, again, these nationalistic kinds of contexts, right, where there's increasing conflation of nationality and religion, the entire nation can then become to be seen as a religious context, right? India itself can be seen as a Hindu context. Israel itself can be seen as a Jewish context, etc., right? So if that starts to become the case, right, then what we end up seeing, right, is that individuals might be expected to follow Hindu rules whenever they're in the nation of India, right? And this can also sort of explain sort of the prevalence of conflicts, particularly in these kinds of societies. So we've done some work on this from a developmental perspective, where again, we've used this implicit association test where we show children the words Muslim and Hindu, and then they have to sort of categorize images as Indian or as foreign. So this first image here is an image from India of the national government, and the second image is Stonehenge, so that would be foreign, right? And what we find is that Hindu children are faster to do this kind of association when they're categorizing Hindu and Indian with the same hands, which indicates sort of an implicit Indian equals Hindu association, whereas Muslim children don't show that association, right? But we see basically that this kind of rhetoric that associates a nation with a religion is becoming internalized by young children as well. So finally, beyond context, what accounts for why norms are sometimes applied to members of other groups, right? So I've talked about the role of context. Obviously, I think when you experience threat or conflicts from another group, we see that that can also sort of affect intergroup relations. And it could be the case that when you experience conflict with another group, you start to sort of think that your own norms are better, your own beliefs are better, and the other group's norms and beliefs are not as good. It's also possible that there might be sort of a belief that's sort of parasitic on this sort of intergroup bias that leads individuals to think that their own religious norms are important to follow, not just for religious reasons, but for intrinsic reasons. So in other words, it's not just wrong to eat beef because the Hindu gods told you not to eat beef. It's wrong to eat beef because there's something intrinsically wrong with eating beef, right? And indeed, we see this kind of rhetoric in among the Hindu cow protectors. So for example, they say, but youth, we need to tell them that the cow is our mother and we need to protect her. It's easy to motivate a youth in regular intervals. We motivate the boys. We show them videos of how a cow, who is our mother, is tortured. We motivate them emotionally, right? And the key thing here is to say that it's our mother. If anybody sort of believes that the cow is your mother, then of course you're going to think that it's wrong for someone to harm a cow, even if they don't sort of subscribe to that religion, that religious norm, right? So there could be an intrinsic sort of value that's seen here. Finally, maybe just to close on a more hopeful note, I think that our findings suggest that belief in one's own religion don't have to imply intolerance to another religion's practices, right? So remember that finding from that second study that I presented, we actually found that an individual who's more religious, so a more religious Hindu, is actually more likely to say that a Muslim should follow Muslim norms, and vice versa. A more religious Muslim is more likely to say that a Hindu person should follow Hindu norms, right? So this suggests maybe values within a religion that generate tolerance for differences, the love thy neighbor kind of value. And it's important to consider whether this kind of finding might generalize to other contexts and populations. So for example, in cases of religious fundamentalism, it would seem as if being more religious for a fundamentalist goes hand in hand with less tolerance, right? Sort of this idea that my religion is the only path. So if I'm really identifying with my religion, then I'm actually not going to think that it's important for someone from another religion to follow their norms. So we're interested really in understanding the differences between this, what really leads to this kind of fundamentalist kind of orientation. So we're extending this work in a number of different ways. One way that we're thinking about extending this is to really try to consider the social and cognitive challenge that religious norms present for children. So for example, these children are often saying, Hindu kids, for example, are often saying that it's okay for individuals from another religion to not, to eat beef, right, to violate a Hindu norm. So what we're interested in is how children justify why it's important for they themselves to follow their religion's norms when they think it's actually okay for members of other religions or atheists to violate those norms, right? And we think that there could be a couple of reasons for this, right? So one reason might be that they think that their own religion's norms are just better than the norms of another religion. Maybe they think that their own religion's norms sort of reflect sort of the word of God, the will of God, more than the norms of other religions. There's a lot of possibilities here. We're also interested in sort of extending this work to a younger age range. So we've done work with 5-year-olds and up, so 5 to 9. And we're interested in sort of how this sort of differentiation of religious norms from moral norms sort of emerges over development, right? And actually what we find is that younger kids, so 6 to 7-year-olds, are actually more likely to apply their own group's norms to members of another religion than older kids. So it seems as if children are sort of gradually discovering the difference between these religious norms and moral norms, like not harming someone else. We're also interested in how these sort of concepts of religious norms are transmitted to children. So for example, how do parents sort of communicate religious norms to children? How are they communicated in the media? How do peers sort of communicate them to one another? What are the key sources of transmission of these ideas from one generation to another generation and within a generation as well? And as part of this project, what we're doing is we're teaming up with researchers around the world. So where we're able to look at the development of these religious concepts about norms, but also about other kinds of religious beliefs, not just in Hindu kids and Muslim kids in India, but across cultures. So we're interested in sort of how this develops in children who are exposed to different kinds of religions, in different kinds of societies that might vary, for example, in the level of intergroup contact and where the religion itself might vary. So you might imagine, for example, that there might be interesting differences between proselytizing religions versus non-proselytizing religions. There might be differences between majority religions or minority religions. So this is part of a much broader set of projects that's being conducted across many different sites around the world currently. Okay, so with that, I will thank you all. Thank you for listening. If anybody has any questions, I would love to hear them and would love to talk about it more. Thanks, everybody. Yeah, in the back, in the very back. Can you say the last part again? Sorry. Yeah. Yeah. So the question was whether, given the findings here, would it make sense to sort of wait on introducing religion to children until they're older and able to sort of sort these things apart, like whether the norms apply to my religion or another. I mean, obviously, we don't have the power to sort of shape how parents introduce their kids to religion. But I think what we're really interested in is it's possible that there are genuine cognitive or developmental changes that prevent a younger child from being able to apply the norms of their group only to their own group. But it's also possible that a lot of that has to do just sort of with the way in which they're introduced to those norms early in life. So it's not, I wouldn't necessarily say that the transition from age 6 to 9 is a clear transition, that a necessary transition across different sites or across different kinds of experiential contexts. And that's sort of why we really need to study this across a wider set of contexts to really understand that. That's a great question. Yeah, I think I saw a hand. Yeah, please. Mm. Yeah, so these are questions that could occupy somebody for a lifetime of research, I think, and those are really great questions. I think one thing that I would say is that simply the presence of diversity certainly is not enough to, I think, it's not sufficient to sort of lead to this kind of religious tolerance, I think, right? So we see cases where religious groups live side by side without very much sort of conflict. And we see other cases where they live side by side and there's a lot of conflict. And really, I think the goal of this research program is to understand, to what extent can a psychological explanation and account, can that help us differentiate between the conditions that lead to that conflict versus tolerance? And the idea is that, on the face of it, the letter of these religious norms can conflict across different groups, right? So, for example, in Hinduism, it's required to cremate the body. In Islam, it's required to bury the body. There's prohibitions against eating beef in Hinduism, but not in Islam, right? So there are these conflicts on the surface if you look at those religious norms, but really they don't have to generate conflicts if you construe those norms psychologically in particular ways, right? So if you construe them in a way that it only applies to your own group, then that's really important for, I think, for permitting that kind of tolerance. But I think that a lot more needs to be done to understand what are the factors that might lead an individual to be more likely to extend their norms when evaluating members of other groups. And I think that some of the factors you mentioned, like echo chambers and so on, those are the kinds of things probably that can sort of lead to sort of biased kinds of beliefs and concepts, right? Kind of like the examples that I was showing you with the Hindu cow protectors, you could imagine that if an individual's only getting that kind of information, that's going to sort of affect things. But it's not something that we've really studied thus far, but I think it's really important. Next, yeah. Yeah. That's a great question. I actually wasn't aware of this being sort of removed from textbooks recently. And you're referring to this case here where, as I said, there was a mosque that was there and it was taken down recently for the Hindu temple. So yeah, I mean, we see this kind of, it's sort of the playbook that that the Hindu nationalists are following is one that's followed in other contexts as well. There's a debate in this country, right, about kind of critical race theory and do we need to sort of the idea of banning books, removing certain content from books. And one can imagine that if you don't are exposed to, if you're exposed to a biased narrative in which Muslims are invaders, right, and the only sort of people who have the rights of the country are Hindus, that's going to sort of affect things. It's not something that's easy to study given the current socio-political context as well, unfortunately, right? So a lot of our research is taking place at a school that is specifically sort of focused on a pluralistic mission, a mission of tolerance. It enrolls roughly half Hindu and half Muslim participants, right? Sorry, not participants, children at school, right? And that actually goes very much against the demographics in Gujarat, where Muslims are about 10% of the population in Vadodara, where we did our research. So yes, I think to do studies like that would require, I think, being able to it would require being able to work in different kinds of schools in which there's different kinds of exposure that the kids are getting. But I think it is really important. We can start to do things in studies where we manipulate the kind of information and narratives that are presented to participants and see how that shapes things. And there is work like that. There's also work relatedly on representations of Native people in the US. So, for example, most of us, when we were taking American history, I guess I'm older than a lot of you, but when we were taking American history, we didn't see a lot of modern representations of Native Americans. Most of the representations we saw were black and white photos that sort of lead into this myth, right, that Native Americans are no longer here, right? And that can affect things in a really real way. So I do think that sort of the structure of education matters a lot. And so I think that this would have a big effect, but it'll be important to study, but it's just hard to kind of study socio-politically in India, at least. Please.
How is that like, for example, should they be able during the daytime humor, how was that like, how the tolerance between leadership and
Yeah, that's a great question as well. We did some studies on this topic. It is another study in the paper that I presented about kind of how children and adults actually balance sort of following religious rules with following secular kind of norms, maybe. So, for example, you wear uniforms for sports, right? But when that can sort of conflict with sort of your dress code for religion. And one of the things we found is that individuals who are more religious were sort of more sympathetic to the religious person, sort of following their own religious norms, right? Uh, Even when this meant sort of not following the secular context norms. But I think, definitely these contexts, like the school that we work in, has to sort of navigate this really carefully. And so, they do this by doing things like allowing for both a Hindu prayer and a Muslim prayer, kind of at the beginning of each school. There's definitely sort of um, allowances and accommodations is the better word to make sure that if an individual has a religious norm they have to follow, they have the space to follow that. So, for example, a place to pray, right? And I think that they would very much avoid probably doing things like serving beef, things that might actually lead to some potential offensiveness, some ideas that this was offensive by students from one community. So there's a lot of sort of navigating that I think is important. Yeah. Yes. Hmm. Yeah, that's a great question too. So I think it's religion and culture are sort of inextricably tied together, right? And sometimes it's hard to know, is this a cultural norm? Is it a religious norm, right? And very much could be the case that different religious norms are followed by members of different castes, so in the Hindu system, right? We haven't studied this so much in the context of religious norms. We have looked at sort of how children develop sort of concepts of caste and attitudes toward members of different castes, and we see that they show more positive attitudes toward Brahmins than toward Dalits. Dalits are the sort of the scheduled caste, the lowest caste. So we see this evidence very early on, again by third grade. And even though, right, there's been a long history of affirmative action in India where there's reservations in government and in education for members of scheduled castes, you still see very much sort of inequities in terms of access to resources and so on. And you see these kinds of psychological attitudes as well. But yeah, I think it would be very interesting to study sort of how this might be manifested in different ways for individuals in different castes, which again is kind of a more intersectional lens on these questions. Similarly, we can look at gender differences, right? Whether some of these norms might be patriarchal, right? And we can think about how to boys versus girls reason about them, and how do they balance the religious norm versus the moral norm. Right? And the last question. Okay, so last question, yeah, in the very back. Yeah, we have not looked at this in the diaspora at all. I mean, yeah, we not really. So yeah, I think it would be really interesting to do. We've tried to sort of do some of this work with Muslim and Christians in the US. And that's something that we would like to do more of. A lot of this really involves kind of a long process of building trust with communities. A lot of the Muslim communities are rightly so kind of a little fearful of outsiders in academia. So there's a lot of kind of relationship building that has to be done there, and hopefully we'll do more of that and succeed with that, and also hopefully contribute to those communities too. Well, thank you all very much. If anyone has questions, you can send me an email. It's my last name at berkeley.edu, and I would love to hear from you. And otherwise, have a good rest of your conference. Take care.